attending. It's good to have you all on board. I have got quite a lot of slides available here anyway, but I want to go through some of the basics. The slides will be available to you later on, so don't worry about finding difficulties in understanding some of the points. We will be making them available, as I said, from the presentation itself. Anyway, risk is a big subject. I've been dealing with it now for some time. Do excuse the typo at the top, fraud management. That is a previous webinar I've actually done. Some of the issues actually do overlap, but risk in itself, I've been working with Setym, in fact, on something like 3 years, teaching risk, if you can call it teaching, dealing with risk management for a variety of government authorities in West Africa. And it had led actually to various spin-offs, various other areas. And this may be something that you want to consider depending upon which organization you are working with or from, and for that matter, particular areas of risk management, whether they are in organization itself, revenue, management in itself, protection, security. All these have a fairly strong aspect of risk to them. And that's why there is always the need to look at the basis, how it all starts in terms of fundamentals, foundations, basics, and then leading to development of structures and analysis. Now, I have put in this presentation some brief guidelines as to how to look at risk management. It is not a panacea. It is not, this is the way you must do it. But from my own experience dealing with audits of major organizations, I always find that a basic risk analysis goes a long way into understanding where the company or the organization is now and where they want to be, whether in a year's time, 3 years, 5 years, and the list goes on. So that means the development of a system which can be used internally as well as externally for audits, for overall monitoring and control, indeed just for peace of mind, if nothing else, but certainly to reduce potential risk, but also enable the company to engage in rather better control mechanisms. And these indeed, the control side of things is what I deal with a lot in terms of business cybernetics, in terms of cybernetic synergy, and the list goes on. But today I want to look very much at this idea of the basics of risk management and effectively how to start a risk management process. So, as in the words of Mission Impossible, for those of you who've ever seen the movies, without referring to Jim or anybody else, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to prove that risk can be reduced, controlled, and managed in order to reduce exposition to, I suppose I should have said, potential loss or damage. And of course, good luck, which is a way of saying the challenge is yours. I'm here to perhaps suggest some guidelines, but then it's over to you in order to take it forward. So taking risks, that's simple. The moment we wake and get up out of bed in the morning, life is a risk in itself. Is the electric kettle going to work to make us a coffee, for example? Crossing the road, what would happen if a car suddenly comes out of nowhere? Well, the last thing we want to do is for it to hit us. Drive in England in the winter, it's not just cars coming at you, it's the possibility of ice on the road and whether you would slip on it. And I know that in Canada, in Montreal, that may well start in about November. And I've seen enough videos to see what happens when cars come down streets on a hill and they try to brake and they slide and they hit a bus. So driving the car, city traffic, most cities have traffic problems. That in itself is a huge risk. Taking a flight, well, as we know at the moment, with all the restrictions on SARS-CoV, even that gets a challenge because the fact we have to use face masks, and there we are, not wearing a face mask during COVID-19. Are we brave enough to say, oh, we're not going to be affected by it? Well, it depends where in the world you are. We still got a few problems in the UK. In Europe, they're experiencing a second wave in many cases. So again, these are issues that are personal, but again, they could potentially affect us. Leaving your house or car unlocked. Well, in some places it doesn't matter because nobody's likely to steal it. There are other places you most definitely do not use that. Otherwise, there'll be a burglary. So don't tell us, or rather, don't say you weren't warned. Insurance companies would never like it. If you leave your house or your car unlocked, you are inviting trouble. Weighing up the disadvantages or advantages, even in terms of cost-benefit analysis, risks are taken purely and simply in determining potentially what exposition to problems there is in an organization. It could be information technology, electronics, data. Data can be hacked into, as we well know. There are huge security issues these days in terms of data management, data protection, the risks that our computer systems can be easily hacked into, whether from Russia, China, North Korea, or even down the road, depending upon how enterprising our local adolescent community might be. And believe you me, there are certain people of maybe the age of 15 or 16 who are extremely good at hacking into systems. Indeed, you may or may not know that major organizations actually recruit past criminals because they are known to be able to hack into computer systems extremely easily, and they are really worth the weight in gold. Management decisions. Now, the decision tree is an extremely important element of any organizational strategy, because decisions are based on viability, they are based on feasibility, but they're also based on potential risk in the sense of what would happen if it went wrong. Management decisions are based on caution. They're based on weighing up all the possibilities and then making a decision effectively based on how much research have they done, and equally, how aware are they of all the environmental issues around them. And I don't just mean environment in terms of the climate. I mean business environments in terms of competition, cost, demand, supply, and for that matter, market volatility. Gambling is a risk factor. Anybody who goes to Las Vegas does so because they know that they can lose as much as they can win. Gambling of any sort is what we call a game of chance. And chance is risks. So we have no guarantee of winning. We can lose a lot of money on gambling, but at the same time, if we really strike lucky, we can equally make a lot of money, whether it's a lottery, whether it is casinos, whether it is horse racing, it doesn't matter. It is still gambling, and the element of chance is the major part of it. And then, as they say, speculation to accumulate. Now, speculation in terms of property says we're going to buy a property at a lower price and then wait for the value of it to go up. The stock market is absolutely no different. Speculating to accumulate then means that you buy low, you sell high. Well, that's the principle. What happens if the bottom falls out of the market? Well, that is a risk you have to take. And of course, in insurance, insurance is based entirely on risk, which means, therefore, that if you insure a venture, there is a possibility of that venture going wrong. Some years ago, Lloyd's of London, and some of you may know of the organization, invested in some extremely high-risk projects. There were developments in California and Florida. Well, California was subject to earthquakes and Florida is subject to hurricanes. And as it happens, the syndicates, in other words, the underwriters, were not told as to what the risks were. And in fact, there were many celebrities, multimillionaires, who invested quite heavily in these ventures. And actually, some of them lost a huge amount of money because of a series of catastrophes that happened at the same time. This was indeed hurricanes in Florida, earthquakes in California, bushfires in Australia. And the combined total of the damage was such that, as they were the underwriters, they had to pay up. And it was an accumulated set of ventures. And indeed, it did cost a lot of them a lot of money. And part of the problem was they had never been informed as to what these potential risks were. I mean, yes, you can make a lot of money if the high-risk venture pays off, but you could equally stand to lose it. And this is why in the insurance business, you have to be well aware of what the risks are and basically take calculated risks based on the approximate likelihood of anything going wrong. So why risk management? Well, presence of the threat. Is there a threat? A threat of hacking, a threat of possible loss or damage? any sort of threat of environmental issues. This is something we all have to think about, because inevitably there may be a threat from somewhere. It may not be an enemy attack. It could simply be something natural, the threat of bad weather, the threat, as I said, of a breach in security. Now, I was in the British Customs and Excise for quite some years, and I was very aware of what possible threats were in terms of security, contraband, smuggling, fraud in itself. And these were areas we had to combat. So we were basing a lot of what we did on pure risk management to determine what is the risk of the government losing money. Now, any tax consultant or even tax officer within the government department would tell you they have this responsibility of revenue protection as much as they have revenue collection. And that means, therefore, they must take steps to protect the revenue at all costs, basically. And that means investigations, it means vetting and monitoring in, obviously, the event of possible fraud, and very definitely to ensure that revenue is not lost. But the same, of course, goes for any organization. Any major organization or industry has to look at the risk factor, because there is this threat that something could go wrong. Equally, the possibility of failure. A project such as a construction project looks nice on paper, but what happens if the earthquake that could happen does, and of course knocks half the buildings flat? This is something we have to take into account. Failure of major financial projects. We had a program recently on TV here about Enron, the big US energy giant that collapsed very suddenly. And it turned out that there'd been problems within the company for years, but they'd never been resolved. Nobody even bothered looking at it. Menitoyan, you've raised your hand. Is anybody there, or shall I carry on?
I think you can carry on, Mark.
Thank you. Okay. In fact, if you could maybe leave any questions that are not absolutely vital till the end, because obviously it takes more time then to answer them. The other premise, if it can go wrong, it will. We have this joke called Murphy's Law, and in many countries they use it. But there is this issue of potential weaknesses in any form of venture or project, saying that if there is some possibility that there is a flaw, sooner or later it will be found, but preferably found before it creates a huge problem in the organization, which is why feedback in lots of ways is so important. And indeed, feedback is an area I deal a lot in cybernetics and control management, because it then dictates, do we have a potential issue that we need to resolve now before it really becomes bad and could end up prejudicing or compromising the project we're dealing with. Now, Murphy's Law, I know a lot of people refer to it, but again, it's a way of saying, what are we doing to protect ourselves against the possibility of something going badly wrong and causing us huge problems, especially when we're not looking. In lots of ways, when we take our eye off the ball, when we do not look at an issue, then it is possible that that issue could create problems because we are not monitoring it. And that means the issue of monitoring, vetting, control. To what extent can you mitigate the issues you have in order to not just reduce the risk, but if possible, even eliminate it altogether, although that is rather more difficult. Therefore, protection of property, and I don't just mean buildings or houses, our homes, for example. I'm referring to anything which we own. It could be a car, it could be domestic appliances, anything that we see as personal goods, anything that we see that belongs to us, because it is that still has problems potentially, and we need to protect it and make sure that it is not going to come to any harm. Would you believe it even includes family, whether it's your wife, your children, your grandchildren? Everything like that is seen as a resource. It's a human resource, but it's precious to us. It has a value. It has an intrinsic value of being family, flesh and blood. But we still look at it as something that we must protect. That is a basic responsibility, and that means we shield what we have against risks. We don't let our kids wander around in the street in case they get knocked down. We're not going to deliberately go out of our way to cause problems, but at the same time, we are responsible for families. We are responsible for what we own, and that means anything to do with either property or resources, we have a duty to protect and manage in some ways, because if we don't, we risk some form of problem occurring. Well-being is this peace of mind. It is a state of comfort, of satisfaction, and of contentment. It is basically saying, as long as we feel safe, then we are in a better position. Within the SARS-CoV environment, safety has been crucial. And I think most people sooner or later would say we have to protect ourselves as well as those around us. Now, I'm not saying we stay prisoners in our own homes all the time, but we have to take precautions. Hygiene is part of this. Overall awareness. We do not deliberately seek to go out and find trouble. That is not what we are here for. And obviously, when we have these threats against us, we have to make sure that we are protected in some form, which means peace of mind. Can I go to bed at night and sleep properly? As the Irish say, to be sure, because I want to make sure that I have a good night's sleep and not have any nightmares because of what is happening around me. We protect, as I said earlier, revenue. We protect what we have, our resources of whatever kind they are. We also need to protect the integrity of our systems, computer systems in particularly, but overall company structures, so that we do not countenance the idea that there is a potential compromise, whether it is in the form of a breakdown of management or security, even to the point that making sure that our internal structures within the organizations where we work are totally integrated. And therefore, there is no such thing as a breakdown in communication. Because these days, in any corporate or organizational environment, communication is vital. And we must make sure that our systems are protected in all those cases. Because again, the risk is that we can say something and somebody elsewhere doesn't understand what we've said. You look at the environments where you have multicultural, multilingual, for example, big multinationals, where everybody assumes that everybody else speaks English. There is no guarantee of this. This is why I speak various languages. Apart from English, I am fluent in French, and I'm also fluent in Portuguese, with a very good working knowledge of Spanish and equally German. And you find that when you have these abilities, we can communicate. I find that when I'm in Canada, for example, it's one thing being in Ontario where they speak English, but in Quebec, I automatically switch to French because this is the language of Quebec. Similarly, when I'm in France, Belgium, Western Switzerland, where again, French is the main language. My wife is Brazilian, so I speak Portuguese. In fact, I speak both Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese of Portugal, and I find it very useful when at least I can communicate with everybody involved. But then I wouldn't expect everybody else to be in the same position, and I have to be flexible on this. Now, security, very important, because there are huge risks involved with it, as there are with insurance. Insurance is a risk business. That's why it exists. It exists to effectively reduce or account for risk and therefore calculate and guard against it. Security, of course. We need security to make sure we can protect that which is our own. Reliability. Can we rely on other companies to supply us? The supply chain is built on risk, because it is to do with the reliability of supplies, the reliability of our suppliers, our customers, and so it goes on. And then overall, cost reduction. In other words, we do not want to find ourselves being forced to spend a fortune on something because it went wrong, or we have to replace something because it didn't work. And then, of course, efficiency. Does the system run without too much of a cost? Is it efficient? Is it manageable? Is it reliable? Well, when you have high risk, there is no guarantee of this at all. And indeed, the higher the risk, the more likely it is that efficiency will be at a low level. And that is where we cannot afford to simply go on thinking, oh, it's fine as it is. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, because sooner or later it will have to be fixed. So the definition of risk is the combination of the frequency and the severity of the consequence. In other words, what would happen if it did go wrong. Firstly, the likelihood of the occurrence. How likely is it to happen? Is it very unlikely? In other words, it won't happen. Or is it very, very likely? It means we need to prepare for it because the chances are it is going to happen within a short time. And then the probability of the severity of the unpredictable consequences. In other words, it's not just them happening. How severe would they be in terms of the impact? Basically saying, it's not so much it's going to happen, how much damage is it going to inflict when indeed it does happen? And then the combination of these, in other words, the likelihood multiplied by the level of impact, will actually tell us what our risk level is, because the higher the result from the multiplication, then the more likely it is we have to do something pretty quickly in order to resolve it or prevent it from getting even worse still. So risk is the uncertainty, the fact that we cannot predict what would happen. It is a likelihood that will happen. In statistics, we call it probability. What is the probability that something will go wrong, that something will break down? The older an item is, or the more heavily used it is, then the probability of something going wrong might be rather higher than a new item which we've just bought, just installed, because we do not expect it to go wrong. If it's a washing machine, a microwave oven, even a car, we assume that once we buy it, it will work first time. The older the appliance, especially if we buy second-hand or third-hand cars, well, there is a risk that, of course, we inherit problems and we may have to spend a lot of money on repairing the vehicle. So it is, in this case, the probability of something happening against it not happening. And this is a mathematical formula that says P, which is our probability, multiplied by 1 minus P, that it won't happen. And that would give us a form of distribution in statistics that would then say what is therefore the risk factor based on the probabilities concerned. Now, another calculation, R, where we have the risk equals the sum of the likelihood of anything happening versus the loss. And given that we may have a series of events or a series of activities, then in total we would multiply the likelihood against the impact for each activity and then totalize it. So the total risk is the sum of everything happening within our activities, within our organization. It could be production activities, it could be any form of process, because that will then tell us throughout each stage of that process, what are the potential risks? And therefore, what do we need to do? Number one, to quantify them, and then secondly, to address them, and consequently reduce them. And this is something which every organization should have in place, whether it is manufacturing, whether it's service-based, whether it is administration, it doesn't matter. Because in every situation, there is a need for a degree of risk control, risk analysis, risk management, because of the potential of something going wrong. And that is why, whether it's the supply chain, whether it's pure manufacturing, whether it is organizational administration, there has to be some form of risk management in place. Firstly, to monitor the processes, and secondly, to identify potential problems, even maybe before they happen, and then take remedial steps, which is what we call mitigating action, to reduce that risk. Now, I will come on to a little later the difference between raw risk, which is the risk you start off with when you are analyzing a project, and then what we call residual risk, which is what you end up with after you have taken remedial action. And hopefully the residual risk will be a lot lower than the original raw risk. And this I will explain in terms of risk registered shortly. So we have the likelihood and then we have the impact of loss. So it is, as I said earlier, the likelihood of something going wrong against the level of impact if it did go wrong. Now, the types of risk, there's plenty of them. And I'm not going to go through them all in absolute detail because I think they speak for themselves. Most companies, most organizations are, of course, concerned with the financial risk, in other words, loss of money. But it is only one form of risk, the loss of, let's say, a product, the loss while goods are in transit. Let's say they're on the high seas and the ship goes through a hurricane or a very strong storm and the waves bash it about and some of the containers fall off. And I've seen that happening. I've seen the results of it. And believe you me, the level of loss can be very, very substantial, but the shipping lines have to be insured against it in something we call general average. Destruction says, what is the likelihood of something literally being destroyed? If it was an earthquake, for example, if it was a hurricane, what's the likelihood of your house being destroyed? Well, in Florida, it's a problem they have to live with every year. We have friends down near Tampa, and they live very close to the water, and they're constantly aware that they may be evacuated because the Gulf of Mexico may turn nasty because of another hurricane. And it's a way of life. Not that it's necessarily a way of life we want, but if you want to buy a house down on the waterfront, well, be prepared for that sort of thing happening. And then, of course, we have pilferage, loss or theft. Now, theft is something to do with fraud, and I explained that when I did a recent webinar again for Setym, and basically the thought that something can be robbed out of your house, your car, indeed it could be company finances. Pilferage means theft of some description. It normally refers to the theft of objects, but theft in general is a major issue where there will always be a risk, and in some countries that risk is higher than in others. Brazil happens to be one of them. The same could be said for some European countries. Certainly in the Americas, it can be an issue. Accident. Well, whenever we drive a car, what's the possibility that we either bump into something or something bumps into us? You look at the number of train crashes there are. Well, of course, more people are likely to be hurt or killed in that. And air accidents worse still. I was watching a video not long ago about the crash between two 747s on the island of Tenerife back in March 1977. Something like 850 people killed because the fact that two 747s collided on the main runway. We don't like to go into it, but at the same time, accidents do happen, and therefore, are we insured against them? And indeed, do we try to make sure that they won't affect us or that they will not happen? These are always major issues, and to that extent, risk is a vital element of this, depending upon what the causation is, and for that matter, what the impact would be. Delay goes without saying. You're in a traffic jam, you can't get anywhere. You're waiting at the airport, and the airport's fog bound, so the flights aren't going to be taking off for the next hour or so. This is always something we have to live with. What is the risk of it happening? It depends on the time of year, the weather. It certainly depends very much on technical issues. In other words, we can't find the pilot, or the engines aren't working, or whatever it may be. But it can give us problems if we do not take them into account. We cannot necessarily avoid them from happening, but what we can do is account for them and make sure that we are prepared or cushioned in the event that a delay will occur. And then the old one that, oh, we can't control it, it's called force majeure. It's always been talked about as an act of God. In my view, God doesn't work that way. God likes things to move properly. I'm a Christian, and therefore I believe very much that things happen in a very ordered way. Force majeure might tell us otherwise. What happens if a hurricane suddenly blows up in the middle of the Caribbean? What happens if, let's say, there is a major riot or a strike somewhere because of political unrest? What happens if, let's say, there is an earthquake or whatever it may be? This is something we cannot control. It's out of our remit. And hence, force majeure says it is something beyond our scope, but it still has to be accounted for in things like insurance. So in terms of travel insurance, cargo insurance, this is always something that is taken into account. The objectives, therefore, the identification of risk. Can we identify? Do we know what it actually is? There's our first port of call. Identify the risk so that at least you know what beast you are playing with. Because if we don't, we will end up coming off the worst. We have to be able to identify the risk first of all, which will then tell us what do we need to do in order to either avoid it or at least to guard against it. Then comes risk mitigation and control. In other words, remedial action that reduces the potential risk, in other words, the raw risk that I talked about, to what we call residual risk, which is the resulting risk after we have taken action. Because it's that resulting risk which we seek, let's say, from having a high risk raw element because we're not prepared for things or we don't have control procedures in place, down to at very worst medium risk and possibly low risk because we have taken steps to control our processes and have in place a series of remedial actions so that every time we engage in a venture, we know therefore how to control it. So automatically we are seeking to reduce that risk wherever possible, which is the next point. Risk reduction from high to medium, from medium to low, so that ultimately we are looking at the lowest risk possible. And then finally, the complete elimination of risk, which can be difficult. It is difficult to reduce the risk to zero because in reality in this world, there is no such thing as no risk at all. There will be always some element of risk in what we do. But if we calculate it and we take steps to avoid it, it will mean that potentially we are less vulnerable to that risk than simply if we allowed it to be there and did absolutely nothing to quantify it or even control it. So the management of it, identify the possible threat or the risk, and then assess the vulnerability of critical assets, in other words, that which you hold most dear, to the specific threats or the risks. Now, critical assets can be anything to do with company property, finances, products, materials, human resources very definitely, because after all, human resources are what makes any organization work. The last thing we want is our workforce to be suddenly hit by a virus as with COVID. We want to make sure that they're safe. We want to make sure that everybody involved is safe. It's the same with any environment. With any form of crisis, the first thing you think of is certainly yourselves, but also those around you. Shield them. And then you look at property to do with company, etc., which is why in the earthquake zones, the one thing is evacuate or keep people safe so that they're not likely to be compromised or affected by the earthquake in some nasty way. So the vulnerability then says we are all vulnerable, but to what extent can we reduce that vulnerability? And then determine the actual risk itself, in other words, the likelihood and the impact, and therefore the consequences of specific types of threats to specific assets, whether it is computer technology, programs, operating systems, hacking, as I said, anything which could be severely compromised, even things like the internet. You look today at information and how it travels. You look at the fact we have satellites. We no longer have the privacy we used to. I mean, this very computer has enough technology in it for a satellite to pick up the fact that I'm sitting in my house in the middle of northwestern England in the county of Lancashire, and that it knows where I am to the point of knowing my local stores and what am I going to be buying tonight or sometime, because I get adverts to that effect. It knows where I am. If I drive my car, my engine management assembly system is also picked up by the satellites. It knows where I'm going to be next time I travel up the motorway to Scotland or wherever else it may be. So it means that there is this monitoring system available, and therefore, to a degree, I am being monitored all the time I'm here. Even my watch has a sort of computer system in. I know my mobile phone does because that picks up the same things as my computer does. So you see, in that respect, the issue of protection of assets, and therefore to what extent am I being protected against whatever's going on? The identification of ways of reducing these risks. Well, there is no set answer. It is how you actually deal with the risk that then determines how you will reduce the potential of any loss or the likelihood of anything happening. And that's why risk in some ways is a very unique thing. Nobody will have exactly the same solutions to either the risks themselves or the means of resolving them. That is entirely up to how you personally act, or for that matter, how your organization works. And then the prioritization of risk reduction measures based on a strategy. In other words, we don't just say we're going to deal with it. Is there a strategy in place that enables us to control our risks by a proper, scheduled, chronicled risk management system that says for every process we deal with, this is the risk reduction strategy we have in terms of monitoring, in terms of vetting, in terms of control. Indeed, some of this is cybernetics management because it's looking at things like viable systems models. It certainly looks at feedback. It looks at control mechanisms to say, does the mechanism we have control the total process that we're dealing with? And this is an area I cover a lot when I deal with cybernetics management. So you see, in all this, there has to be a solution that is tailor-made or based on what we actually do, because although the skeletal theory might be the same, the actual approach by every organization will be different because it depends on the level of the risk, the number of the risks, and that to that extent, the possibility of compromise or vulnerability, because they will not be the same for every organization. So the formal assessment, I mentioned structures, it is this: the identification of the risk, the assessment of the risk control options, which I'll come to in a minute, the regulation, basically, the control mechanism, a cost-benefit analysis to determine what would be the cost of dealing with these risks as opposed to what is the value we get out of them. And then the decision-making recommendations, which is what option are we going to select, because it depends upon what we call our risk appetite. In other words, to what extent are we prepared to accept the risk depending on the potential adversity or compromise which it might engender. Because again, the lower the risk, the less likely it is we will take remedial action. The higher the risk, the more likely it is we need to implement a solution, because we need to make sure that we are not going to be made vulnerable or compromised by that potential or even actual risk. The process then is addressing the risks. Right, let's identify them, let's quantify them, let's determine what they actually are. You don't know the battle you're going to fight until you understand your enemy. Now, in a military strategy, no commander goes into a battle without knowing something about his enemy. If we'd done that, we'd have probably lost the last war. There has to be strategy involved in this. We have to know what our enemy is. And our enemy does not have to be a military army. Our enemy, as I said, can be hidden. It could be hacking into a computer system. It could be potentials of breakdowns in the system. An enemy is there, and you can remember this as a key thought. The enemy is there to destroy us. The enemy is there to cause as much problems as it possibly can. We are here to stop that enemy attacking us, or even if it tries to have the fortification up, to say that we are adequately defended against it. And that is a key area. To what extent are we protected? And this is an obvious situation because we have to be protected. So, addressing the risks. What is the risk? Quantifying it. How bad is it? How grave is the whole thing? Control and mitigation. How then do we come against it? How do we limit it? How do we control it? And what mitigating action must we take in organizations? Staff training, competence and awareness, documentary procedures. Certainly my involvement with the customs organization here in the UK, it demands that companies have documented procedures, specific operating procedures, of course, as they're known, SOPs. This again is part of the whole issue of mitigation. There has to be some form of mitigating action in place to say, if we are confronted by a risk, what action do we take in order to reduce it? Do we need more training? Do we need documentary procedures? Do we need more vetting systems? These days, the issue of protection is increasingly prevalent. How can we protect ourselves? Do we have a decent security-based system in place? And by that, I don't just mean high fences, electrified fences for that matter, border guards, etc. No. Any form of defense means, do we have systems in place in our computers, for example, or anything else that are capable of protecting us against any form of perceived or actual threat or any form of risk that could compromise what we're doing. And then on top of it, it's not just having a system in place, it's monitoring it. And this is an essential part of any business activity, even government and administration. You have to be able to monitor your processes on a regular basis, whether that would be yearly, monthly, weekly, maybe that's a bit too often, but certainly monthly. Every 6 months, every year, you have to undertake monitoring exercises to determine whether the system now is as good as it was 6 months ago, or do you need to finally tune it and amend it to make it even more effective than it was before because of changing circumstances, changing environments, changing political issues, economic issues very definitely, or for that matter, simply basic efficiency. Because ultimately, if you take your eye off the ball and you cease to be as vigilant, then the likelihood is that something will go wrong. Vigilance and due diligence are two major issues in risk management because it means we are taking an interest in what we're doing, but we are constantly making sure that the system works properly and that we are using effective systems in the form of feedback to determine, is it working? If not, who's told anybody and what are we going to do about it? Because this is vital in the process. We need to be constantly aware of what is happening and therefore to monitor it and controlling it. And again, this is part of the principle of cybernetics. So a simplified view, what can go wrong will. Perceived risk against actual risk, the loaded gun. You can have a gun on a table, even on the floor, but if you don't touch it, there is no problem with it, even if it's loaded. The only time it becomes a threat is when you pick it up and put your finger on the trigger. If you press it and nothing happens, it could be a form of Russian roulette. It could be that it's not armed at all. But the point is, you have actually increased the risk, the very fact you picked that gun up. If you left it where it was and nobody touched it, it is very low risk to anybody. And for heaven's sake, don't let kids play with them. I've seen enough newspaper reports of a kid in America who finds his father's gun, points it at somebody and pulls the trigger. Well, no wonder it goes wrong. But then you do not excite risk. You do not encourage it. If there is a perceived risk, you keep it out of harm's way. How bad and how likely would it be? Can processes be improved? Of course they can. That is the purpose of the exercise. To improve your processes up to the point when risk is reduced to the absolute minimum. What would it cost and how much better would it be? There is, of course, a cost, and the cost-benefit analysis tells you what is the value of actually taking steps to reduce the risk, and therefore what gains do you get out of it? What action should be taken? What can we do to stop it from happening again? Well, there's all sorts of ways. Something about the stable door being bolted, but the horse has already galloped off. And it all too often happens that we're very knowledgeable about geology the morning after the earthquake. But wasn't the purpose of the exercise, as they often say, if you're up to your neck in alligators, to drain the swamp? Because that's what tells us the alligators are there in the first place. You just go down to the bayous of Louisiana or even the Everglades swamp and you soon realize what it's all about. You do not take chances lest an alligator suddenly launch itself out of the water and that's an end of you. This is something where, quite simply, take action before the risk has actually manifested itself, or at least to reduce it. Let's not invite problems. Now the matrix, and this is, I'm not going to go into it now, but it's available on the slides. And if anybody is interested, we can easily send you copies of this because this is one of the major solutions. But you'll see it goes from dark green to very bright red. It's a bit like traffic lights. When it's green to go, you can proceed, there's not a problem. When it's yellow, you'd better put your brakes on because the lights are going to go to red. In some places, people don't even bother with that. Why do we have crashes at crossroads? Well, I think we can understand. The point is, if it looks bad, then it will be red in color. If it's medium, well, we can accept it to a point, but we need to deal with it. If it's green, let's not put too much effort into it. It isn't worth it. We're throwing money into a black hole. So as I said, this is available for all of you later on. We can send out all the information and we can easily send you some of these tools. So the rankings are low, medium, high, and critical. Once it's critical, it's gone far too far. It needs to be terminated or stopped or dealt with immediately, because it means it's intolerable. We will not allow, this is what we call risk appetite. It's intolerable. We won't accept it. If it's tolerable, we'll accept it to a point, but we still need to address it. And then negligible says, forget the whole thing. You are, as I said, throwing money into a black hole. Forget it here and now. It isn't worth dealing with. And this is why then we have with a likelihood, rare, very low, occasional, could be possible. Sometimes, maybe it does happen, but it's not necessarily something to worry too much about, but as long as we're aware of it. Frequent, yeah, now it means we need to deal with it. And very often, no, we need to address it like straight away, because we cannot accept the fact that it will be inevitable. It has to be dealt with. Similarly with impact, low, medium. You notice these go from low to high for 1 to 5, where 5 is the maximum for both likelihood and impact. And yet again, what are the issues concerned? If there's little impact because it's low risk, right up to catastrophic results if it's critical, which is what we want to avoid as much as we possibly can. The last thing we can accept is anything's got so bad that it becomes catastrophic, which is why, yet again, feedback is so vital in all this. There's the index. Again, I don't want to go through it. It is something that you can read about. It is something that we can supply to you, but suffice to say it is the multiplication of likelihood against impact. So if it was at the minimum, likelihood is low, number 1, impact is low, number 1, 1 times 1 equals 1. But we go to maximum, let's say 5 in each case. Well, 5 times 5 is 25. So if you actually go through the index, you go from 1, which is absolute minimum, to 25, which is absolute maximum, which is super critical. We need to act. And this is why the matrix is part of this solution. And if anybody is interested, I will willingly send the information out in order to set you on the right road. Indeed, I do a lot of consultancy in particular areas such as tax risk, financial risk, because it's an area I've dealt with now for quite a long time. And as Setym would tell you, I've done a lot of courses in Montreal with various organizations dealing with such issues. So there's a lot of experience in this area. The mitigation areas, which are low in green, little or no immediate action required. Medium, action required but not urgently. In other words, we can put it on a sort of non-priority area on the back burner, but make sure it's still in our minds because we may need to address it in the future. And then high risk, which is red, immediate action is required because otherwise it will create huge problems. And these transfer into the options that I spoke of earlier. They're the 4 T's. Tolerate, because it's low risk, it's not creating a problem. Treating or mitigating it, that is medium risk. So we can take mitigating action in order to reduce the risk ourselves. Now, medium also has transfer. Now, this is for things like insurance. We can't deal with it ourselves, but we know a man who can. The man is an insurance agent. So we're going to contact our insurance company and say, can you deal with this? And they'll say, well, of course we can. It'll cost you a premium, but it means that you will be able to get some form of protection, which we will provide on your behalf, which is why we have insurance. And then terminate, which is high. The idea of terminate, we are not going to have this at all, get rid of it, because otherwise it will cause us huge problems. In this case, then, what do? Design a new business process with built-in risk control. We then periodically reassess these risks that are accepted in an ongoing process because these are part of our business operations, and then we modify our mitigation measures according to our need for risk assessment, and therefore do we need to change anything on an ongoing basis. Transferring risks to an external agency, in other words insurance, because we cannot afford to take on that risk ourselves. They will protect us because policies allow them to make sure that if there is anything wrong, they will compensate us or reimburse us in the case of any adversity, whether it's holidays, car crashes, whatever. Of course, health insurance in some cases is a necessity. Places like America, where health is a very costly business, and therefore you need an insurance policy. In most cases where you have a national health system of some sorts, that does, of course, alleviate that, but there may be cases, even as in Canada, where you still have to pay for some form of insurance because of surgery or something that may be even things like physiotherapy that may be outside the normal health remit. And then we have avoid risks altogether. Well, it's difficult to do so. Life is a risk, as I said, but at least we can address particularly high risk areas and avoid them altogether or simply terminate them, because this is not something that we want to entertain or even tolerate. Treatments are there: avoidance, elimination, withdrawing from it; reduction, so we mitigate, we reduce the likelihood and the impact of the risk, or certainly reduce the likelihood, which means the impact should come down anyway. We then share it. We transfer out to other authorities, as I said, things like logistics. That's why we use freight agents. We have insurance policies. All this is called sharing. We cannot physically deal with it, but we know an organization that can. And that means we use those organizations in order to reduce the risk and take off our shoulders some of that burden. And then retention, in other words, it's not creating a problem. We will accept for it and budget it because it's not costing us a fortune. It isn't giving us particular problems, at least not for the moment. So let's bear in mind that if we do need to deal with it, we are equipped already. Otherwise, it's not giving us a major problem. So therefore, let's not throw resources at it. The decision matrix, high and low in each case, and you'll see there quite simply, where it is a high likelihood but a low impact, we will manage it. If it's low impact, low likelihood, we accept it, we tolerate it. In the case of high risk combination for likelihood and impact, we then reduce it or transfer it or terminate it because we cannot afford to maintain it, or it would not do us any favors. And then in the case of a low likelihood but a high impact, so we insure against it, because it means then at least if there were a problem, we will be compensated or indemnified against it. The plan then. As I said, there is no hard and fast solution. But as I said earlier, it becomes the issue of identification of risks, using a risk register, which I wanted to mention because it's effectively a graphical table. It's a spreadsheet. And you start off effectively with what the issue is, documentation, procedures, whatever it might be, human resources, and you have an initial raw risk. That's the present risk that it is now. So what are we going to do? We're going to have training. We're going to introduce documented procedures. So we're mitigating our activities, which then leads to a reduced residual risk. And a risk register is not difficult to set up. If any of you are interested, I can arrange to send you a template into how I deal with it. It may not be what you want to do, but it's certainly a possibility. There is a draft for it, and it gives you a rough guideline as to how to arrange it. Appropriate controls to measure each risk. In other words, mitigating actions. What do we need to do to measure and to control the risk? And then the applicable and effective controls for the management of risk. And then, of course, monitoring all these activities on a regular basis to ensure that our risk has not increased, that in fact it remains constantly and consistently reduced as time goes on, so that we are cushioned against any improbability or probability of any adverse action. Because constant monitoring means we are aware of what is going on. It is pure awareness, and it's vigilance. This is the main area. Are we vigilant? Are we diligent? The ideas of vigilance, in other words, aware of what goes on, and due diligence, which means we are taking the appropriate steps to ensure compliance, as well as the minimalization of risk, if at all possible. We have, in fact, finished more or less on time. Thank you very much for attending. I hope it has been of use. Please, questions, do ask them. Even if you think of them afterwards, please do send them to Setym, because I and the others are here to answer them. This is an introduction. I would like to think that in a short time we will be back to a degree of normality or normalcy, and we will be able to deliver more in-depth courses in these areas. But may I say thank you for attending. My thanks, of course, to Jean-Michel, to Jonathan, and to Larbi for organising this. And I wish you well and every safety and security. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your very interesting introduction on the risk management. So the floor is open. If anybody has a specific question, Belinda Marfay just asked if they would get a copy of your slides. Yes, you can listen again to this webinar online. It will be available as of next week, most probably, and you will be receiving a copy of the presentation through your email box in the upcoming days as well. So as Mark proposes, if you have specific requests regarding the matrix or so other tools that can be of use, in the meantime, till we are to take back our face-to-face presentation with our courses that will take place end of September, beginning of October, if the situation allows it, we will be pleased to send it to you through your mailbox. Mark, yes, somebody asked about the risk template, risk register template. We will send it to all of you. And in the meantime, if any questions come to mind, please send us a line, and we'll be pleased to answer to you. Instead of answering to individuals, we will post all the questions and answers for the benefit of all.
Okay. I will send through a copy of the Excel spreadsheet of the risk register as well to Setym, and they can then send it on to you. It's only a draft. It is a very basic structure, but it does show you how to deal with an analysis or typical analysis, which you can then use to your own effect. But as I said, I will send it via Setym. It will be Setym's property. So again, I leave it to Jean-Michel and to Larbi as regards how they disseminate it. And then obviously any further guidance that we wish to deliver, we will do so.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. This is highly appreciated. If no, we've got one question from David Ajibioye, sorry, which mentioned, what is the difference between incident and an accident?
An incident is something which can simply happen. In other words, it could be a near miss. It could be just something that occurs. An incident can be anything to do with, it could be an accident, but it is not necessarily something which actually creates damage. An incident is something which we're aware of. An accident does cause damage because it causes a degree of destruction or loss. An incident won't go that far necessarily. However, it is still worth noting because it tells us we have to guard against it or avoid it happening again. An incident can be something as simple as we drop a piece of bread on the floor. The fact we might not be eating it is another matter, but an accident will say we spill boiling water on ourselves, which is going to burn us. So you see, an incident may be there and it happens, but it does not necessarily cause any problems. An accident most certainly does.
Thanks for the precision. And to answer to probably another Mr. Ajiboye, Peter this time, not David. I hope we can get more in depth on the subject and on this course. Yes, there is a lot more to say because that meant to be only an introduction. Just to let you know, we are to publish in the upcoming weeks our 2021 program, which will include an annual course on risk management for 2 weeks, not only 1 hour. So this is to be advertised in the upcoming weeks. So please keep an eye on our website, and you can see at which dates it's going to be offered. And finally, maybe we can close it up with Dr. Raman, which is a regular attendant to our webinar. How can we minimize the risk management? Or what is the good balance, if I can surf on his comment, what is the good balance on the effort being put in on risk management and doing what we've got to
Right. Risk management is a cost. It ultimately results in a cost of either damage or loss of some description. The risk management makes the balance between gain, where in fact you're not losing, you're gaining from it, as opposed to losing. The purpose of risk management is to reduce the risks. As I said, you cannot necessarily eliminate it, but what you can do is manage it to the point that it does not create problems for you. From moving from, for example, terminating a risk to tolerating it. That's why I had the 4 T's. If you remember, I said, tolerate it says, we know it's there, but it's not giving us a problem. Terminate says it's there and it will cause a problem. So management says, reduce that risk if you possibly can from the highest level to the lowest level possible. There is a phrase we use and it is called ALARP, as low as is reasonably possible or practical. Make it such we can manage it and we control it. That is what management is about. It's called control, which is why I've now got available a session on cybernetics. It's not massive things like time and motion. It is feedback. Are we using a control mechanism that says we know what we're doing? And this is why these areas in life in general, whether it's COVID, whether it is national crisis, whether it's government revenue, it amounts to the same thing. Manage it. Make sure you are in control of it so that it does not go out of hand. So that's what your risk management is.
Totally right. And I think, as you've mentioned quite few times during this webinar, life is a risk. So we wish you all non-threatening week up till the next webinar. We will close